who is the director of the Ahmose and Tetisheri Project. He has his PhD from the University of Pennsylvania, and he's excavating at the mortuary complex of Ahmose in Abydos. He's also does tours for AIA, which we'll go with that. And he's appeared on Nova, the History Channel, National Geographic, the Travel Channel, as far as I know, not Family Feud.
Yeah, but I have appeared with the other Steve Harvey on national TV. So
very nice. So without further ado, Dr. Steve Harvey.
Hi, I just want to make sure everyone can hear me. Can you hear me in the back? I have a pretty good loud voice, so hopefully this will help amplify to you all. Well, I want to start by saying thank you. This is my first visit to Colorado, first visit to Denver, and I had a beautiful day today with Laura Hazel, to whom I thank. A wonderful stay with my dear friends Bill and Nancy Petty, and a nice dinner with Jim Loudermilk. So I thank you all and the whole society. It's a pleasure to be here and a treat to speak to you in this really nice space. So forget the museum, I think. This is now, what I'm talking about tonight is a little unorthodox. At first, you'll think, why is he talking about comics at all? And here on the title screen, we have my title of the lecture, but you also see a cartoon by an artist named Joe Brainerd. And Joe is kind of humorously creating speech bubbles above these ancient Egyptian figures. But what I'm here to really tell you about is that is humorous, but not very far from the truth, because in fact, many ancient Egyptian tomb scenes in particular are filled with captions. And these captions have been recognized by many scholars to function much like our modern idea of comics. So here, for example, a tomb that many of you who've been to Egypt have been inside of, the tomb of Merope at Saqqara. And we have two dwarves who are making beautiful gold jewelry, and on the top here, on the inscription in ancient Egyptian, it says something that we can easily recognize as being spoken by this man, because it's in his orientation, hieroglyphs point the same way as he does. And he's saying, this necklace, it is very beautiful, my companion. And that's a very typical kind of example of one of these captioned scenes, which function very much like modern comics. Now, more typical are, well, other scenes that we'll talk about in a moment. But in fact, the great Egyptologist Thomas Schneider has written an interesting book you might enjoy called Ancient Egypt Investigated, 101 Important Questions. And he asks the question, were there comics in ancient Egypt? And his answer is, actual precursors of modern comic strips are attested since the Old Kingdom. And then he defines this as a narrative sequence of images, sometimes with explanatory captions, or the words spoken by the people involved. Now, I'm not that interested tonight in explanatory captions. What I'm interested in are the words spoken or sung by people who are shown in tomb scenes, and what those are doing and how we come to understand those. And it's also going to be, I think, a little bit of an interesting romp through the history of the decipherment of ancient Egyptian, starting, of course, most famously with Jean-François Champollion in the 1820s. Now, this is just another example to show you a very typical kind of scene from a stela, a slab covered with inscriptions and scenes where a man is sitting down with his wife and he's being offered something to drink, in this case probably beer. And it says, words spoken by the butler, this man called Khari, and he's saying, this is for your cause, for your spirit, your life force. So this man is performing an action. We see again from the hieroglyphs that the orientation is in the direction of the speaker. And then there's the actual speech bubble, not surrounded, of course, by an actual bubble in ancient Egypt. They left that for the literate to figure out. Now, the amazing thing about this technique and this interest in representing speeches and conversations is that it persists through the entire length of Egyptian civilization. So this is a tomb that some of you might have been in as well, in Tomb El Gebel near Amarna, opposite side of the Nile, the tomb of Petosiris. And this is a tomb from the Persian period, 4th century BC. So this is, almost 3,000 years after the early scenes that we're talking about, where we see people in basically Greek and Persian clothes, making, in this case, also gold items in Persian feminine style. And what's happening is that they are having conversations. There are different speeches being said by these individuals. And I'm not going to go into that translation of that. But this is just to say that this is something that accompanies tomb scenes through the entire history of Egyptian civilization. Now, of course, ancient Egypt was not alone in this interest of depicting speeches. And as the decipherment of Maya hieroglyphs in Central America has developed since the 1980s, when I was in graduate school, and really exploded, we can now look at some of these vases from the Maya region and see that these hieroglyphic texts include speeches by figures, such as this rabbit figure. This one's known as the rabbit vase. And there's sort of humorous things that are being said. So this rabbit is holding clothing of this naked god. And what apparently is being said is, what's happened to my jewels, my clothing, and my tribute? So these hieroglyphs in the Maya script above this figure are, and you can see speech coming out as curls, almost like of smoke, out of the mouth of this deity is speaking, just like on the Egyptian example. So what is unsurprising to me, and I think to you too, is it's a human impulse to depict figures in speech once you have literacy, and to do this in a very interactive and interesting way. Now, what I find fascinating is that the first recorded examples that I know of, I think that any of us know of, showing these conversations are recorded as early as the 17th century. Of course, they couldn't be read at that date, but the Renaissance scholar, I call him a polymath here, or a Renaissance man, you could say, Athanasius Kircher, published this scene of slaughter in a book about hieroglyphs where he didn't understand what they were. He thought they were mystical, but in fact, we can just look at this now and read the hieroglyphs on his woodcut in his 1676 volume and realize that it's a conversation. And scholars have looked at this and are able to read the scene quite easily. And what we call, in Egyptological literature, we call these conversations, we of course have to use a difficult German word or phrase, so Reden und Rufe is speeches and calls. It's the term that Egyptologists still use for it. So most of this stuff is only published in German or in French academic work, and you won't easily access it unless you go deep into the literature. Now, Kircher was amazing, by the way, and he was the first to really begin to suggest that Coptic was the survival of ancient Egyptian language, and even though he never came close to deciphering hieroglyphs, he still is an important figure along the Renaissance and then Baroque rediscovery of the ancient Egyptian script. So here's someone, a scholar, has taken that piece published by Kircher, which we don't know where it is. It's lost somewhere in a museum or still up in the ground again. And they've represented it as we think it probably would look. And we can then translate it. And the man on the right, for example, is slaughtering this oryx, longhorn oryx, and he's saying, hold it firmly, if you please. So this is very typical of the kind of so-called ancient Egyptian comics we get, scenes where workers are carrying out the preparation of food, in particular for the afterlife, and we'll see many more examples tonight. So this one could not be, of course, read properly, and in fact, none of these texts could be read at all, and none of the history of Egypt, aside from the Greek tradition, was available to anyone until finally Jean-François Champollion made the breakthrough, which nearly killed him, of understanding the Rosetta Stone and other texts. Which really only was made possible with the publication of this famous text. The letter to Mr. Dacier was the head of the Royal Academy of Inscriptions, and with this in 1822, suddenly we were able to read a lot of inscriptions, and I'll talk more about Champollion in a minute. Of course, other scholars like Thomas Young in England could read cartouches law. Remember, of course, that cartouche is nothing other than a French word that really is what we use to decipher and describe these name rings surrounding names of royals in ancient Egypt. And I'm saying that for a reason, just to remind you. Of course, we know that ancient Egyptian writing is a wonderful system that is deeply interconnected with art, because in addition to the signs being drawn from the natural built world, the human world, they also have orientation, so they can be written right to left, up to right, top to bottom, and in different orientations either way. And we read, of course, into the pictures, the faces and the animals and the birds, and that gives us the orientation. And so Egyptian scenes can be very interestingly played out, where you have many people in a scene and all of their words match their orientation. That helps us understand who's talking. Now, there is something fascinating that's developing, which is an emerging field of trying to really look at comics not as children's play, but as a very important method for conveying narrative of image and text together. We all know this from childhood, right? We all begin with comics, but in fact, comic studies is an emerging academic field, and this comic artist, Scott McCloud, is one of the most important of the writers who wrote this book, Understanding Comics, and a few others in 1993. And his work has been fascinating to me because I have this kind of insight that really, looking at Egyptian tomb scenes and temple scenes, we should be maybe trying to get insights from film studies and comic studies to just see what the theory is, how they approach narrative analysis of images. Now the problem is that Scott McCloud is a smart man, but he doesn't know anything about ancient Egypt. So what does he do? He goes to the bookstore or the library and reads what he can. He tells us, for example, and this is my writing here, comic studies, in my opinion, feature a poor grasp of how Egyptian writing works. They build on the popular impression that hieroglyphs are just sequences of images to be interpreted, like Precursor did before Champollion deciphered hieroglyphs, rather than a real language. So here we see, for example, at the top, from Understanding Comics, we have Scott McCloud. You can read it yourself. He says that hieroglyphs only represent sounds. But in fact, that's not right. We know that hieroglyphs are both represent sounds and ideas. And so this is not entirely correct. And you can even see, if you know a little bit about hieroglyphs, that he's using budge for analyzing hieroglyphs. EA laws, budge's works, which are the worst possible thing to use. Another understanding from a different source is that hieroglyphs are in cartouches, which are like speech bubbles. And this is not the case. Of course, cartouches, as I just reminded you, are the way that the ancient Egyptians surrounded royal names. So this is from a book called The Invention of Comics that otherwise is quite interesting, published in 2016. In more recent times, the link to the culture of comics has been reinforced with the comparison of the cartouches are displayed with speech bubbles. Well, that's nonsense, nothing to do with it. So what's a shame, and what I'm trying to tell you, is that the comic studies people are looking at Egyptian material, but they don't understand what to do with it, because they don't have an Egyptologist to help them. So what I'm doing tonight, and what I'm proposing to try to do with my research coming up, is to sort of help out the broader world who wants to understand what Egyptian art and writing is up to when it works like comics. And just here at the top right, an example of a speech bubble to kind of give us what this is, we all know. Now, going on with McCloud, he then says that hieroglyphs is a little bit, relates more to written language than to sequential narrative. But in fact, there's a lot of interaction between writing and art in Egypt, as we even saw from our first ancient Egyptian examples. Now, I want to move along here to say that McCloud was trying to understand ancient Egyptian tomb scenes, and he said, I was studying, been trying to find sequence in Egyptian paintings for years. When I began this book, and ready to call it quits until I discovered that the books I've been using as a reference have only been showing part of the picture. So here's an example of a tomb scene many of you know, where there's agricultural activity going on. And then he said, here's the complete scene, painted over 32 centuries ago for the tomb of Mena. This is an 18th dynasty tomb in western Thebes. And he says that, and correctly, that this is to be read in zigzag format, going up and across. And we know that because anybody can study and understand the sequence of agriculture from harvest to threshing to transport of the grain and its storage. So this is an interesting example, by the way, of just one case of how we can see the order as not what we would expect. It's not read from the top down, left to right, like we would read a comic. Now, the problem is that McCloud is totally wrong here, and this is not actually the full scene, but we'll come to that in a moment. He does sensitively try to understand what the tomb scenes show. So, for example, 3 workers reaping wheat with their sickles, then carrying it in baskets to a threshing location. In the background, 2 girls fight over bits of wheat left behind as 2 workers sit under a tree, one sleeping, one playing the flute. Well, what we get out of this is he's recognizing the ancient Egyptian artists used humor. They had vignettes or elements from daily life that brought the scene to life. But notice there's no hieroglyphs in this example at all. And then he shows us other things, the oxen treading the kernels, peasants separating the wheat from the chaff, threshing and winnowing, Mena looking on at the scene, scribes recording this, an official measuring the land, and then farmers who are late in paying their taxes are eaten. All of this is perfectly correct, and he gets the Egyptological stamp of approval for these interpretations. The problem is when he said, I discovered the whole scene, he's completely wrong. In fact, here's the east wall agricultural scene from the tomb of Mena at Thebes, and you can see that the red area is what I've superposed his sketch drawing on top of the actual photograph of the scene, and you can see that it's not really looking at the whole thing. He doesn't have good access to good data, because he can talk to an Egyptologist, right? He's just going with what he can find himself. But there's a bigger problem. Due to the unfinished nature of the tomb scene in Mena, unlike almost any other tomb that I could have wandered into at Luxor, there are no hieroglyphs at all. So this is the one tomb that has no captions, speeches, songs, or conversations precisely where we might expect them. And as I say, even his complete scene shows less than half of the agricultural scene of the tomb. Unfortunately, he picked one of the worst possible examples. So his conclusions about Egyptian art that have gone into comics literature, and I want to tell you that every book, if you go on the internet and look up history of comics, Scott McCloud's name is going to be the name. He's the man. And every book has gotten the wrong idea about what Egyptian art is, does, how it works, and how inscriptions work. That is not good. So let's just look at some examples that one can turn to as an Egyptologist and just start to draw some conclusions from. This is one of the most famous tomb paintings in all of Egyptology. Now in the British Museum, originally from the tomb of Nebamun, from the time of the reign of about the III, 18th dynasty, so 3,500 years ago. This is a man who's gesturing to these cattle. And what you have above it is actually a speech. And he's saying to the animals, come on, move off, don't speak in front of this favorite one. He's talking to the workers he's with, as well as to the animals in a way. People who talk are his horror, the tomb owner's horror. He does what's true, he won't pass over any complaint. Pass on quietly, he will not just do the bidding of the people, he knows everything. Does no. Well, what does this tell us? It's actually an interesting text. It tells us that the Egyptians in some cases thought that you should be quiet when you're in the tomb, relatively speaking, not raucous and loud. And scholars have tried to understand more about that. But the main point is you can look at almost any scene, even the most famous tomb, and see that the whole thing is filled with inscriptions, conversations, and songs. So that nearly every tomb you could possibly think of in the Old, Middle, and New Kingdoms, as well as the late period, is filled with this type of material. Here's a fun example, and a kind of thing that I think shows you how close you can come to cartoons sometimes. I've numbered the figures here. Number 1 here, a drunken doorman is sleeping. He's sleeping on the job as he's supposed to guard a bunch of sealed wine jars. That's what this room is full of. Number 1, the man says, the servant is sleeping. He's pointing to him, and this guy's clearly asleep. Number 2, this guy's saying he's drunk from wine. And number 3 says, I wasn't really asleep. Or he says, I didn't sleep or really sleep. So he says, I was just napping. So it's a humorous scene, right? I love this because it's exactly what comics do. It's taking a daily life situation. The people are all conversing and interacting. If you can't read the hieroglyphs, you don't have any idea what the scene is. It's just taken as a serious scene of the delivery of wine by some men. But if you can read the scene, it comes alive, and you get the humor of the artist, right? So that raises a question I'll come to later. Who could read these scenes? Who was literate? What was the function of these? What was the point of making humor and making life come to life within the tomb? Was it purely religious, or did it have other functions? Okay, so that's just the actual tomb scene, which is sadly pretty ruined in reality. So it was recorded before this damage occurred. Now, one of my favorite examples I'm going to talk the most about is a tomb that I know Bill Petty also loves, and a site that I've been to with Bill a few times, El Cab, where there are tombs of the early 18th dynasty. And the tomb of Paheri is one of the most interestingly decorated from the middle part of the 18th dynasty. And here we have Paheri in a couple of settings. One, he is here painting on with a brush on a tablet here, and he's got all his writing equipment in front of him. Another, he's standing and looking at the agricultural work in the fields, and the captions here say, watching the seasons of harvest and the season of planting, and all the occupations performed in the fields. And indeed, the artist has shown all of his occupations, including agricultural labor, very much like what I just talked about, the Mena and Scott McCloud used, and the horse and chariot of the tomb owner, and then ships being loaded with grain, and we'll talk about all this in more detail. But it's a wonderful scene, and it is filled with the conversations and songs that really should have been the focus of interest of someone looking at this kind of inscription. So here's the view into the tomb. It's a very simple tomb. You just walk right in, and there it is. All the scenes on the wall. Just to remind you about ancient Egypt, tombs like this, the chapels were above ground, accessible to family members and those generations later who wanted to come in and leave offerings of food and wine and so on, and beer for the deceased person. There were statues in the back. You could leave these offerings too, representing the dead man and his wife and other family members. There's scenes covering the walls showing all of this, and actual burials are down below and not accessible. So tomb open and accessible, burials, that is to say the bodies themselves are not accessible. El Cab, just to show you where it is along the Nile. We're not going to sweat about that now. If you haven't been there, do go. Now, the actual tomb itself in photographic form. Now, what's fascinating is you see here, and I don't have to really elaborate it for you, above almost every figure are inscriptions. And we'll look at many of these in more detail. There's also a lot of 19th century graffiti, and that is because this tomb was discovered in 1799 by the French under Napoleon, who came throughout Egypt in the attempt to take over Egypt, and in doing, of course, recorded many, many early sites, many Egyptian tombs. And so this is one of the longest known inscribed tombs in all of Egyptology, and Champollion himself went there, studied it, and read the text. And so this is one of the earliest read 18th dynasty anythings. So here we see, for example, the French publication by a man called Costas, before anyone could read hieroglyphs. Think about this for a minute. 1799, Napoleon is in charge, but coming to Egypt, nobody can read a single sign, not one. And so they're going into these tombs and they're saying, what is going on these walls? You can see agriculture, but who knows whether any of these things say anything or what they say. 1820, 26, 1830, everything can be read by Champollion and then by other scholars. It's amazing in 30 years what was possible. So here, from the description of Egypt, the famous folio volumes, I'm just reinforcing this. 30 years after discovery, Champollion could see that there were songs and captions on the wall. So Costas, this is what he said in 1809. This was a tomb of the Sultan. Well, okay, it was actually a tomb of Paheri. He wasn't a king, he was a wealthy man. He said the scenes were, the hoe, for example, was a symbol of the protective genius. So, like, a hoe wasn't the hieroglyph for, as we know, the word for love or to like. He thought it was some symbolic thing that was just made up. Recognized that larger figures were probably the owner of the land, but he thought that signs showed the Christian cross, which of course doesn't make any sense. This is 1,500 years before Christ, and thought that Paheri and his wife were gods receiving offerings. So this is just to really reinforce for you how little was known about 1800. 20 years later, Champollion published and talked about this song, Above the Sea Thresher. And it's a very interesting little story. In a letter to his brother, who was also fascinated with ancient Egypt and hieroglyphs, Champollion is his brother's name, and the 12th of March, 1829, Champollion writes, and this is not published publicly, which is a letter, I noticed among other things the threshing or beating of corn sheaves by oxen, and above the sea will read in almost entirely phonetic hieroglyphs the song which the overseer of the thresher is supposed to sing. Clearly, in old Egypt, as in the one today, everything is done by singing, and that is true still today. A lot of work accompanied by singing, and each type of work has its own song. So here is one of threshing grain, a type of short speech addressed to the bulls, and which I next found with very minor variation in much more ancient tunes. And then Champollion does something which I think is mind-blowing. I don't think probably a lot of you know this, but he already could read what it sounded like at that point. Hitenu neten, sepsanu ehu, hitenu neten, and oipe neten, and oipe and netenu. Well, that's pretty good. If you look at it through the lens of Coptic, the last known spoken version of the sound, it's probably what it sounds like, but what it means is very interesting. The man is threshing, and he's singing to the oxen, threshing for you twice, O bulls, threshing for you twice, bushels for you, bushels for your masters. He says the poetry is not terribly brilliant, the melody probably carried the song. Well, isn't that amazing? Within 30 years of the discovery of the tune, somebody could read it. What's interesting is, you see the zoom scene here, recovered in a drawing of the early 19th century. This is the man driving the oxen. This is the threshing floor, which probably was circular, and this is the song written above it. Here in a modern translation, thresh for your own good, thresh for your own good, oxen, thresh for your own good. The chaff you shall eat, for your masters is the corn. Do not tire, it is quite cool, oxen, thresh on. So he's singing to the bulls, and what he's saying is, you get the straw, but we get the good stuff. We get the actual grain. Well, now, what I find interesting, and this is a little bit of a leap, but at the same time that Napoleon's invading Egypt, and Champollion's deciphering the hieroglyphs, there's a lot of interest in narrative scenes and displaying narrative in ways that reflect an interest in moving pictures in France. This, for example, is an illustrated scroll that was rolled out by an artist called Louis de Carentel, and he did transparent painted scroll performances with live narration in the 1780s. So at the same time that the French are discovering these tomb scenes, there's a lot of interest in France in different ways of performing narrative. And I was talking to Bill Petty in his home. He's got a lot of zoetropes and other early devices that do the same thing. They're kind of animation before animation and film before film. The Egyptians, in my opinion, were interested in the same kind of thing, using light, imagery, text, and art to tell stories in a film-practical way. The world's first comics also started at the very moment that Champollion is deciphering these ancient Egyptian scenes, and nobody's ever made this connection before. I have, I think. But 1825, look at that date. This is what we have as the world's first comic, and look what it is, by coincidence. There's a kind of a new interest in Egypt from Napoleon's invasion, and one of the early things in this new format for satire is a mummy escaping out of a mummy case. You see the Sphinx and the pyramids here. This is now pretty clearly one of the earliest Western comics. So I think it's interesting that there's these developments happening in the broader world. Now, in the 1850s, one of the first big books that was really in the English language about Egyptian life and culture based on inscriptions and tombs was Gardner Wilkinson, a popular account of the Egyptians, of manners and customs of the ancient Egyptians. He reproduces the song of the Threshers, that thing that we just described from the tomb of Paheri and other tombs. And he says the discovery translation of this was due to Champollion, to whom all who study hieroglyphics are under such an infinite obligation and whose talents were beyond praise. Truly said and nicely approved of. But there's something interesting, which is by the late 19th century, there was a recognition of something extraordinary, which is both that Champollion had deciphered this early song, and we'll see it again here, but one of the things that is extraordinary is that there was a real doubt about Champollion's decipherment of hieroglyphs. You may not realize this, and I was surprised to learn this, but in the early days, when there's one guy who says, I can read the inscriptions, then there's a lot of people saying, no, you can't, you're making this up, such as George Lilly Craig in this book on English literature, who said that the hieroglyphs can be read as the multiplication table, but that is all. There may be nothing more in them than there is in the multiplication table. But if they were, we could not get it. Monsieur Champollion, indeed, in his enthusiasm, saw a vision of an amateur or bacchanalian song, laughing under the venerable veil of one of them. But it is plain that this must have been an illusion. So, right, 1860s, he's basically saying Champollion is out of his mind. And, so there's a basic debate in the mid-19th century about whether hieroglyphs can be read correctly or not, and that didn't get resolved for quite some time. Now, in this article in the late 19th century, something extraordinary that blows my mind, and I think will interest you too, is that this man, Peter Lepage, recognized that no Egyptologist or folklorist have yet called attention to the fact that these words from part of the song are still sung to this very day by the peasants of Corsica off the coast of France. And here he gives the text of the same song. In Italian, it's drive on you, the grain is for us and the straw is for you, sung to the bulls. And I'll talk a little bit more about that. Here, from a book written for young people to appreciate Corsican traditional culture, and done in a comic form, is the Song of the Thresher, as it's still sung. You can go on YouTube, and you can put in Song of the Thresher, Triviera is the Corsican word for it, and you can hear them sing in polyphonic harmony these songs to the cattle, which are, O thresh you good oxen, let's work together for the grain is for us, the straw is for you. I don't have an explanation for why in a distant part of Western Europe there is still surviving a song that we have on an Egyptian tomb scene 3,500 years ago. Is it coincidence that the same activity, threshing grain with oxen, with the same specific focus of singing to the animals and having this idea existing, is still being formed today? But I want to use this as a way to say to you, and here's just a still of the YouTube, because I don't trust access and getting the video to work for you tonight, so I'm just going to tell you it's fun to listen to. Scholars who study these kinds of work songs, no one on the musicology side has seemed to make the connection back to ancient Egypt, and most Egyptologists don't know that there's this connection to this modern Libyan work song tradition, but indeed there is, and this is just an article to show you from the 1960s that scholars have studied these songs in some detail. So what I want to do is across 3,500 years, put together two scenes and say that these represent two ways of representing a similar setting. The threshing of grain by a man who's leading cattle to break apart the wheat from the chaff. So we can ask ourselves really clearly how similar are ancient Egyptian tomb scenes and comics, with a very specific example that is in fact completely parallel. So let's look at some other scenes instead. We're going to move now away from the Thresher song. That's just, I think, a unique little example. Here is the center of the wall, and we're going to look at this set of women who are all chatting with some men who are serving them alcoholic drinks. And this is a scene from the opposite wall, opposite side of the tomb than the threshing scene. So what we have is the captions naming these different women. Nubenhab, her daughter Sadamun, Nurse Kapu, Nurse Senti, Seneti, Nurse Chapu, and Nutmeni. So a series of named women. Hieroglyphs can just name who's there, but they also have conversations. So here, the servant is offering a bowl of wine. This woman is putting up her hand to say no. This woman is sitting back here holding a lotus, and above are the conversations. This is the speech of this man. This is the speech of this woman here. Number one, he says, for your ka. Here, I'm offering it for your ka. It's to your health, really. That's how they offered a drink in ancient Egypt. Drink to drunkenness, pass a happy day. Listen to what your companion says, don't hold yourself back. So he's saying, drink up, don't hold yourself back. And this lady says, give me 18 cups of wine. See, I want to be drunk. It's drunkenness that I want. I'm as dry as straw. Wonderful scene that you would never guess at unless you could read the hieroglyphs. And I want to really reinforce this point. If you're not literate, you walk into the tomb, and it all looks very formal and nice. This man is offering a drink, this lady is accepting it. But in fact, this woman is kind of drunk and over-enthusiastic. And we'll see some other things happening here. This man, this is further along in the scene, number 3, he's offering a drink of beer. The other one was drinking wine. This is the beer drinking lady. He's saying, drink, don't just sip it. See, I'm not going to let go of you to make you drink this. And she is turning and saying, drink, don't rot away in place, let yourself go, literally dance, and let the jug reach me. See, it belongs to this governor who wants drinking. In other words, Paheri, the tomb owner, wants us to get drunk. So this is just one example to show you how these scenes work. There's interaction between the women talking to each other. There's interaction between the servants and the women who are drinking. And you see how the hand gestures and other things function together a lot like a comic strip. So that really raises the question I was just beginning to talk about. Who could read the text on the walls of ancient Egyptian tombs? We know that most ancient Egyptians were illiterate, right? Probably only 1% of the Egyptian populace could read. That's a very, very small percentage of educated people. Probably some women as well as men. Kaiman, in the tomb there, the 18th dynasty, he asks his visitors to look at his walls and read the sayings. So we know, of course, this is very typical. They would put up inscriptions for people to read out loud who were literate so that they could say the prayers that would bring the food and offerings and eternal life to the dead. This tomb of Nefertari has my favorite quote, it's an obscure one. He wants scribes to repeat the writings so that the illiterate and the workers know what is written on the walls of this tomb. Now, what does that mean? That means that it was sometimes desirable for somebody who could read to go in and read to another group of people who were illiterate and share the content. So that's a kind of a performance or translation of what's on the walls. Graffiti also showed that people came in and appreciated the beauty of the decoration and the presentation. So we see things like someone leaves graffito in a tomb, whether Valley of Kings or private tombs, non-royal tombs. He found it beautiful like that. That's very, very common. And this is just some examples from this article, very interesting recent article about tomb graffiti. And we see here an example of tomb graffiti. This looks like it's a caption, but in fact it's in cursive hieroglyphs written in by a later visitor. And this is just a signature of a graffiti artist, the priest Paheri from the temple of King Ahmose III. He came in and just wrote on top of this figure his name to show, like, Kilroy was here, but also to link himself to the tomb. Now, something fascinating to me is that Egyptian tomb scenes don't just show humans talking, they show animals making noises, and there's been a great advance in understanding this by this lady, Linda Evans, an Australian Egyptologist who looks at animal behavior and birds and other mammals, and sees that, for example, when they show the tongue moving in a scene, that is a physical representation of sound. In this case, a goose hissing and distress calling. So what we're seeing here is a mongoose or ichneumon who's riding up a papyrus stalk and he's attacking a bird. And one of the other geese is hissing to ward off the mongoose and to alert other animals to come and come to the aid of that animal. So isn't that amazing? We even have a soundscape. Think of an Egyptian tomb as a soundscape, not just as a visual scape, but a soundscape too, because the inscriptions and the scenes are showing elements that recognize in that way. Now, something I love is to return to the tomb of Paheri, that Paheri was an artist. Turns out he wasn't just a scribe, but he also was an outline scribe, a draftsman, which means that he was a painter and an artist as well as just someone who could read and someone who could write. Paheri is actually famously shown alongside his famous grandfather, Ahmose, son of Abana. And he's holding his little scribal palette in the tomb of Ahmose, son of Abana. Ahmose, son of Abana, of course, was a soldier, builds, translated his texts, and written about him extensively, who fought along several pharaohs of the 17th and then dynasty, and then the 18th dynasty ruler Ahmose to defeat the Hyksos. And those battle scenes are very interesting, battle texts rather. But what's important is he was most likely the artist responsible for the decoration of the tomb of Ahmose, son of Abana. And this has been documented very clearly by Vivian Davis and other scholars. But the most important contribution that I want to talk about tonight is by a French scholar, Dimitri Leloury, who has studied how the ancient Egyptian artists took elements from different tomb scenes. And I'm not going to describe this whole crazy looking thing tonight, but bottom line, you can tell when you study different tombs that different little details, like the two fighting girls fighting over food, or the sleeping man, or other elements are borrowed from tomb after tomb after tomb by artists who like what they see, borrow it into another tomb, and we can see how creativity plays out in that way. Some interesting examples just to tell you about from the tomb of Paheri that really show how creative Paheri was in decorating his own tomb. Because what I want to tell you that's fascinating is that Paheri and not only decorated his grandfather's tomb in memory of him, but decorated his own tomb. So we have a case where the tomb owner is actually the artist, and this is what Leloury has told us, and I'll tell you more about why. On the left, this old man shown bald here and nearly naked. He is showing that he's still vigorous and youthful, because he's saying, if you bring me 11,009 bushels of linen, it's me who will comb all of them. And this young man on the right says, oh, get on with it, don't chatter, you bald old peasant. So he's kind of rude to the older man who is saying how able he is to still work. This is another slice of life moment. Here, a mother talks to her daughter, and she's saying, give me a hand, or see, we might come back in the evening. Stop your cattiness or your bad behavior yesterday and be quiet today. So again, good behavior is being reinforced, which is the Egyptian ideal. Quietness is being reinforced and not being loud. And the mother is admonishing her daughter in the agriculturals. Other songs of praise and of protest are featured in Paheri's tomb. So here, for example, a song that is written all across the top of this harvesting scene where they're cutting grain with sickles. And I like this one. Fair is the day dawning upon the land. A cool breeze is rising from the north. The sky conforms to our wishes. With steady hearts, let us toil on. I just want to take a second to say, isn't it beautiful that we have the words of songs from ancient Egypt? We don't have the songs in any notation. The Egyptians didn't create musical notation, but we can kind of imagine what they're like from modern Egypt, where worker songs still persist, and also from living traditions like the Corsican and Thresher songs and so on. What's really kind of fascinating is that we can see how artists like Paheri draw their inspiration from the Old Kingdom. So this is an Old Kingdom scene, already ancient at the time of Paheri, where you have things, for example, like a man drinking out of a jug. It's very hot work, by the way, harvesting, and dusty and sweaty and all of that. So people are taking breaks, they're putting the sickle under their arms, and they're drinking from water jugs. And above here, this man says, we know no one who's died from his work. So they're saying we're working hard, but we're getting through it. This is the 18th dynasty scene below. You see the man putting the sickle under his arm, drinking from the jug. The same kind of thing, and indeed, we understand that the Egyptians borrowed from earlier times, both the inscriptions and the decoration. Here's the first known protest song from all of the world, as said by this scholar of music, Ted Gioia, in his book on work songs. He said, here at the dawn of our story we find the first work songs and the first protest songs almost side by side. I love that quote, because it's true. Here we see men, and I mentioned this at the beginning of the talk, loading things onto grain and wine onto this barge. And they're singing a song of protest as they load the grain. They say, are we to spend the whole day carrying barley? The granaries are already so full that heaps of grain run over the granaries. The barges are heavily loaded too, bursting with grain. And yet we are still ordered to make haste. Are our hearts of iron? So they're moaning about what they have to do. Here on the tomb wall, the most lowly workers are given a voice. So rather than being totally silent, this artistic process of narration gives a voice not just to the tomb owner, but to everybody on the walls. They're all speaking at once, and it's kind of this cacophony of interesting songs and writing. So this has given me this idea that I'm workshopping, I'm telling you about. I kind of want to do a graphic novel, a book in cartoon form. This is my rough sketch that would, instead of showing the hieroglyphs, show you the English translation. I'm not sure how I'm going to do it, and I'll make it more legible than this, I promise. But the idea is show the songs where they occur, show the conversations, provide commentary, and really lay out for visitors to Egypt how to understand tomb scenes so that you can enjoy them the same way as a literate Egyptian could. Now, what I find interesting, I love this quote I translated from French here by this scholar, Pascal Mernoux, French scholar. Those who are dependents of the tomb owner vibrate like bees in a hive, busy with carrying out some subordinate task for his greater glory. So what Mernoux does in his work is he describes how all of the people and the whole, what we call visual panoply of the tomb, together with ethical comments about good behavior and illustrations and exhortations to good behavior, as well as examples of misbehavior and chaotic action, form an overall symphony amplified by sound, music, dances, and songs. You could add in animal noises too, probably, as well. Now, I'm going back here just to remind you, McCloud said we could only understand ancient Egyptian art from this one scene he found that goes in a zigzag form. And indeed, that is true for that one tomb scene, but it turns out that scholars who've looked at how tomb scenes work have looked at agricultural scenes. This is from the work of a scholar named Valerie Angenot, and she's seen that there are all sorts of formats. There's this back and forth format for showing scenes that goes right to left to right to left, and we have even spiraling formats, we have zigzag formats. They're so complex that the Egyptians wanted to make it somewhat difficult. You weren't meant to just walk into a tomb and instantly know top, left to bottom right. That is not how it worked. Ancient Egyptian art is a form of puzzle. And it's a form of puzzle that you're meant to use your mind to engage with. So you have to look at orientation of the scenes, the figures, piece the thing together. In other words, spend time in it. They're visual traps for focus. You could say for meditation if you want, but really for entertainment, as I've suggested, also for performance. Because someone who's literate comes in and says, now let's start over here, like a tour guide, right? On the top left, you see this, and then this, and then this, and look at the scenes, and this is what's happening. There would have been competent tour guides, and there would have been incompetent tour guides, probably less literate, as there are in modern Egypt. We even know in the Valley of the Kings, the tomb scenes were not even done in order. So here we have the hours of the night, the 12 hours of the night, according to the tomb of Ahmose III. And what happens is 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12. The Egyptians were perfectly capable of putting it in row, in order, if they wanted to, but they didn't want to because of their religious ideas and concepts. But I think also it is to encourage you to analyze, study, and really take time to pull the whole thing together. And that is the fact. This is proven stuff, not conjecture. This is the order of these two scenes. There's no other way to work it. Now, what is pretty great is that we have not just Paheri's own tomb with these scenes, but Dimitri Labori has shown a series of wall paintings in the Louvre Museum, cut out of a tomb of a man called Wensu, were probably painted by Paheri, the same man whose scenes I've discussed so extensively. We see so many details, the threshing, the particular scenes of mother and daughter. We see conversations, songs occurring. And for example, we can see that what happened is that Wensu and Paheri's tomb were probably designed together by this man Paheri, this artist, maybe using the papyrus master copy. And we can see that shifts, inversions, additions in Paheri's scene are shown in blue. So it's a little complicated, but bottom line, this wall painting shows a different version of the scenes in some slight details than Paheri's tomb, but not very different. So that you can lay one on top of the other, and only these blue things will be the differences. Shifting some figures over, and I'll give you some examples. Here, the scene of the mother and the daughter in the tomb of Paheri. Carved, by the way, in relief. Onto the stone, right? And this is paint on plaster. And yet, you see the mother, the daughter, this woman shown bending over, 1, 2, 3 here, the hieroglyphs above, the hieroglyphs above. And what Paheri's brilliantly done is shown that these are probably the work of the same artist. We know in ancient Egypt that there were master copies that were used to create things also like books of the dead. So here's 2 books of the dead showing a figure at the other side, a figure approaching gods, and how you can compare either they're spread apart or closely together. 2 different papyri, and you can see how people are looking at a common source maybe. This is a little bit of poetry to just say that, and I may blast through this, but a little bit of a response to a famous book on Egyptian art by a scholar called Harvey in Frankfurt. She called her book Arrest and Movement, and most people don't know what that title is drawn from. It's drawn from T.S. Eliot. At the still point of the turning world, neither flesh nor fleshless, neither from nor towards, and at the still point there the dances, but neither arrest nor movement, and do not call it fixity or past, future, or down. I'm quoting this because Egyptian art is about both arrest and movement. It's about stop moments, but also the flow of time. And in a beautiful way, I think we can see how these things work together. But unfortunately, the scholar who used that beautiful poem in her description, in the name of her book, didn't understand what Egyptian art was at all. And in fact, this is the #1 book. If you go to someone and say, I want to understand Egyptian art, tomb scenes, how do I do it? You be told, oh, go read Geographic in Frankfurt, Arrest and Movement. The book is interesting but wrong-headed. So, for example, she says, the sequence of scenes is purely conceptual, not narrative, nor is the writing which occurs with the scenes dramatic in character. The signs, remarks, names, songs, and exclamations which illuminate the action much as does the text of comic strip do not link events or explain their development. They are typical sayings belonging to typical situations, which is completely wrong. I mean, it's just flat out wrong. This is not a scholar who can read these inscriptions, didn't do the work, didn't read the inscriptions properly. Mostly focused on the Near East, not Egypt. So one of the problems we have in Egyptology is we have a poison from within, which is that not even our good sources are good sources. You have to really do the work of going deep into these things to get something out of that. And here is a great praise of the scholars. We're making radically improved understanding of so-called scenes of daily life by interpreting them as the deceased watching life's manifestations rather than as a survey of their activities in life. Revealing their conceptual character as pictographs rather than narrative images of transient events. I'm sorry, but if you're showing harvesting and grain threshing and people singing and conversing, that is, to me, a narrative image of transient events. I mean, this is the wrong way to look at it. So this is just my final kind of conclusion to you. To me, Egyptian tomb scenes invite the visitor to create an individual experience within the tomb, regardless of the intention or schema that the designer employed. The human tendency to explore and enjoy visual and textual elements is unstructured, and artists and designers use innovative images, details, and captions to capture our attention, to provide focus and delight literate and non-literate visitors. There's something there if you can read, something there if you can't. Such experience of performance and reading enhance rather than diminish the sacred aspect of the scenes, which rely upon call and response, performative utterance, saying something, making it happen, and ritual. And what I like to call ancient intellectuals, which we use these terrible modern terms, priests and scribes, for, I think those were horrible terms, by the way. They weren't really priests per se. Scribe is a dead term. It means really someone who's a thinking person, a literate, thinking intellectual. They innovated visual and textual strategies to encourage engage with the content of the tomb as well as entertain the living and the dead. They're funny for a reason. The employment of light, shadow, color, text, and image in addition to performance say to me that the more apt comparison of Egyptian tomb art is with cinema, or contemporary interactive forms such as video installations and museum exhibitions. So when you go to an Egyptian tomb, I encourage you to think about it differently. This is my last slide. This is a museum exhibition that explores soundscape recordings of the natural world by a man called Bertie Krause. It's a wonderful exhibition in Paris that was drawn from a book called The Great Mountain Orchestra. Krause recorded just nature in its full complexity, and then the museum tasked artists with how to represent these different elements of sound in the natural world, and they did paintings of animals making noise, but also this representation of just what the sound was. I think Egyptian tombs are these kind of soundscapes that had so much full experience for people, and that we can really draw more from them than we had previously by looking especially at these very lively textual complements to what we see on the walls. Thanks very much. Okay, do we want to bring up the lights? Does anyone have a question? If not, I'll just say it back. Yes, sir.
Thank you very much. I found that very interesting. A question that did occur to me, the conversational decorations we talked about would all have been in the chapel part rather than the burial chamber.
Right.
Is there any pattern to the placement of it? Do they appear more toward the entrance and get less serious or more serious toward the burial chamber or the location of the burial shaft?
That's an excellent question, and it's a very complicated thing to study because, but I'll quickly say yes, what you have is a focus on more things in the city or daily life and in the life of the tomb owner, agricultural work, if they were a tax collector, the tax collecting, if they were involved in bringing foreigners to the court of the pharaoh, then they're showing that in the outer part of the tomb. Some good examples are the tomb of Graffiti at Thebes. As you go closer toward the cult area, it's more and more about the burial, the funeral, and the sacred rites. And then the behavior, the figures are more staid, they're more restrained, you won't have the humor, you won't have the drunkenness, you won't have the party. So yeah, that's a very good point, and it's something to pull out. When I do this kind of study, I would then try to also talk about how these things vary across the tomb. It's a really interesting question. It's a good point that liveliness tends to occur outside, and as you get closer into the cult goal, just like in a temple, you have battle scenes outside showing daily life things, or let's say protective things, battle with the Hyksos, battle with the Hittites on the outside of Ramses the Great's temple of Abydos, but as you go inside, it's more and more about the gods. Same thing, temples and tombs work the same way. Yeah, sort of the back.
Was humor something that was only for nobility and the intellectuals, or are there examples in the royal?
So, Valley of the King's Tombs, you will not see any case that of overt humor that I could ever think of. If anyone can think of an example, I totally take it back. But that's a very serious set of circumstances because it's about the cosmos. It's about the ability of the sun god to traverse the night sky and meet up against evil forces and come out so the world can continue, time can continue, the world can be reborn, the pharaoh can be reborn. So there's no lightness there. Temples do contain humor, however, and I would draw your attention to the fact that the comparative part to the for a pharaoh to what we're talking about is the temple above ground, which receives cult in relation to the tomb body. So there's this separation there. And there are more lively scenes. Just for example, you can think of fencing in the temple of Ramses III and Bidi and Habu, and scenes that are lighter in character. But that's a very good question. Yes, sir.
I get the sense that we're talking about various portfolios of material that would be appropriate per area.
Per place, you mean
Well,
per
per
town?
area within a tomb
Oh.
or a temple.
Yeah.
Now, would this be material that would be stored in a paramejot or where?
Stored where?
In a paramejot?
I don't know what term you're using there.
In a library?
In a paramejot. I'm sorry, I didn't recognize you were using an Egyptian term. Yeah, in a library, well, we don't know very much about what's stored in libraries, really. We know, like, there's one text I can think of in Neferhotep's 13th dynasty. The pharaoh says, okay, go make an image of Osiris. You have to go into the temple library to get the details of what the temple statue should look like. So there's cases like that, we know. Okay, yeah, so that means that there are strict rules about how to maybe do a royal tomb, how to do a temple. But I don't think when we come to these tombs that there were rules like that. I think the artist, especially if he was building his own tomb, could do whatever he liked within certain cultural frameworks, and that seems clear from Paheri's example, where there's a lot of humor, a lot of innovation. He shifts things around as he likes, because who else is checking? You know, it's his tomb for him. There's not even a client. You know, he's doing it for himself. So it has to fit cultural norms. There's nobody running naked. There's nobody going wild. You know, just think of how there's never sexual activity in an Egyptian tomb except in very limited circumstances, and done only in very certain ways for certain reasons. So there were cultural rules that pertained, but I don't think there were strictures about what you could do. And that's why I like this idea of intellectual artists, because you see that they're borrowing from each other, they're quoting, they're innovating, and they're also drawing from life around them. These are all songs probably that are just part of the repertoire that people all knew. I don't know. And a lot of this is unknown stuff. Yeah, sorry.
Is why this hasn't been presented. I mean, when I was doing a talk on tomb, I saw all these hieroglyphs, and I couldn't translate anything. And now I realize how much more than that lecture would have been if I had been able to. Why aren't there people out there who were translating it and getting it across?
I mean, you know, this is my question, and that's what I'm trying to do. Because I'll tell you, just briefly, right? This is material that was mostly published by German scholars, Ehrman, Grapau, Zeta, Guglielmi, and they're written in obscure German publications like, speeches, calls, and songs of the ancient Egyptians. Well, if you don't read German, you're not going to read that book, and if you don't have a doctorate in Egyptology, you're not going to have trained to learn to read German, to read the inscriptions, and then the inscriptions are difficult, and then you have to read French to read commentary on the German inscriptions. There's almost no literature in English. So, just to draw a picture for you, this is stuff that it's taken me 35 years to get to a point where I can make sense of. And, you also have to have knowledge of how the art works with the images. And so, when I realized that there was this potential to kind of blow this open, I got very excited. And then, to me, the comparison with comics is fun, and it might be a way to draw in young people and others who want to look at this, because they might be able to say, well, why would this be something I would care about? Because ancient Egypt seems very dead to people other than us. and yet it's incredibly lively, so why not pick the liveliest stuff to talk about? But I'm at a point where sometimes just even translating a single sentence, and we all know this, beating our heads against hieroglyph studies is a big project. And there's scholars who argue about which way to translate all of those sentences and put up there. And if there were a famous philologist in the room, they would say, Stephen Harvey left out a terrible job, with this inscription, and it's wrong, So, but my point is, I can get close enough to get it out there and let other people fight over it.
So you mentioned if you want to
book, a huge compendium of lowbrow quote-unquote humor in ancient Egypt. I would recommend looking at some of the collections and translations of the Ostraka.
Yeah, of course. But, that's true, and there's a lot of humor there. I mean, I'm not trying to undertake a study of ancient Egyptian humor. I'm just looking at the conversations and songs, some of which are funny and some of which aren't really manifestly funny. They're just workers talking to each other. The humor is interesting, but it does raise an important point, which is humor also can occur in figural ostraca, also as animal fable kind of images. And we know that those are both funny, there's caricature, there's also animals, like, of course, the famous mouse lady who has the cat servant, right? So the mouse is the inversion of the world, the cat is the slave to the mouse, so the other way around. Of course, that's part of the game, part of the thing, and you have to pull all of that in to remind yourself of what the Egyptians were thinking about on a daily basis and looking at. And what I think is great is that it sort of allows in a little bit of breath into the tune where we see that they were not so stodgy as we think of them. Even in the context of the tune, that the humor was part of what they were doing, not just on the ostraca, like, oh, nobody can see me, I'm doing this behind closed doors, but actually on the walls of the tomb. It's very common that there's a lot of funny stuff that you wouldn't get unless you could read, and that raises the question, maybe the scribes are also doing this for each other. Like, hey guys, when you come in here, you get a little treat, a little hidden perk if you can read it and tease that result. Somebody had their hand up, and I'm sorry, yeah.
Yeah, you mentioned the similarity with the Old Kingdom as far as the artwork went. Were there similarities in the conversations?
Oh yeah, the conversations, like I did show an example of an Old Kingdom conversation, the guy's drinking water, and he's saying, no one ever died from working in the fields. So we've got those starting in the Old Kingdom, 4th Dynasty. So the beginning of tomb scenes at all have the beginning of conversations.
So a tomb like Meroruca then would have conversations.
Tons. Mera was filled with them. And that's what I now like to do when I go in with my tour groups. By the way, I want to just point this out to Jan's question. The guides aren't trained to know this stuff.
Right.
And even if they can read hieroglyphs, often the guides don't know. And I've had a lot of fun with working with one of the museum tours, wonderful guides in Mass, of helping her to teach her to know how to tell that story so that it can be part of what other tours get, and to say, hey, this is part of the fun of what's going on. Market scenes, for example, where they're exchanging things, and they'll say, I'll give you these samples for those fish, and there's a wonderful example, I didn't have time to put it, Old Kingdom, the two brothers, where there's a man, a policeman with an attack baboon, which is what they use instead of an attack dog, and there's a thief who's stolen a fig and he's running out of the market, and the police are saying, attack him, so the baboon is chasing the boy and bites him, and the boy's saying, get this monkey off me, so there's this stuff in the Old Kingdom that is hilarious, and once you translate it to people and you explain it, they're like, huh. I had no clue. The causeway of Unis leading up to that and over that tomb features a market scene with the same thing. So, your stodgy formal royal complexes have it as well as the private tombs. And that is an indicator that it's not something that was just being done to, play in an inappropriate way. It's happening in the royal stage. Yeah.
And have you photographed the soccer club?
I have, I took some cartooning workshops, and I've gotten in touch with him, and he was like, oh, that's interesting, thank you very much. But I was expecting him to say, like, wow, you've blown my mind, this is so cool. And instead it was like, oh, okay, yeah, I look forward to you going, blah. So I was really disappointed, But I can also see where it might come across like this guy is now like the pinata for comic studies, right? He's just a cartoonist who said, I'm going to write a book and do my best. And, it's unfair for me to sit here and turn him into a straw man, because he's actually a really good guy, and this book is fascinating. But the bottom line is, he didn't ask any Egyptologists, and it just made me realize that there could be a whole book just doing this, understanding Egyptian comics, which is the So yeah, I was disappointed, but it's okay, because sometimes when you talk to your heroes, they don't respond the way you think. All right, folks, if there's no other question, I'm just going to say thank you. Oh, there's one more.
This is a short one. So I'm constantly amazed by just the sheer volume of work that we're considering here. Has anybody ever estimated how many artists it took to create this what we're all?
You mean like how many artists in all of ancient Egypt and all the time who did all of the work?
Yeah, like you mentioned, Paheri was an outline draftsman. So
Right.
like, how many artists do you think worked for him?
Oh, that's a good question. We do know something about this from the village of Dermody and the workman's village, right? Because we know, we can look at the team of the right, the team of the left, we know the names of the workmen in different reigns. There's wonderful work by Candy Keller from Berkeley, the late Candy Keller, who looked at one tomb. I was mentioning this to some people last night, the tomb of Inhercow, and she discovered that it was painted by two brothers. So that tomb was painted in the course of a short period of time. It's just paint on plaster fresco technique. Fresco, if it dries, you can't work with it. So it has to be pretty quick. The painting style is rapid, and we know the brothers painted together, and it's just two people. So if it's just painting, it could be a couple of people. If it's carving, somebody, and Bill and I were talking about this last night, somebody's doing the first sketching out and laying out. Somebody, in the case of a carved set of scenes, there's probably sculptors who are doing sculpting, and then painters coming in and painting on top of that. And what's fun in Egyptian tombs, and you have the Valley of Kings everywhere, or Seti first, you can see where someone's drawn something, then the sculptor comes and changes a little bit, then the painter comes and changes a little bit on top of that. So there's like layers of different teams, and there are different techniques and abilities, and so it can go from two people in a private tomb working together in a cramped space to a team of 50, right? All pushing each other out of the way to get the job done and fighting with each other over it. So that's how I see that.
Thank you.
Yeah.
When you say they were brothers, have you included the possibility that they were colleagues calling each other, "Hey brother,
You know,
you used to tell this story about
right. That would
this
be
part
true.
of the patron"?
Good question. That would be true anywhere else except Del Medina, where, you know, there are scholars who just focus on who was who at Del Medina. I mean, there's a raft of scholars. So we know so much about that village that scholars like the great late Yaroslav Cherny could pick up a fragment from Del Medina and recognize the handwriting of individuals. And that is the case with these two brothers who were brothers. They were brothers of the same mother and father. And we know so much about them. In fact, they decorated a tomb, and then they had a legal fight, and then they had a falling out, and never dealt with each other again. So we know so much about that village that we can look in at genealogies of artists.
Walking into the Metropolitan, one of the things that they say at the Metropolitan,
Right.
after they say this person married his sister,
Right.
is, well, you know,
Right.
that happened, but it may be there's way more there for you to decipher
Well,
what they've said.
Right. Well, you know, by the
And
way,
Medina may be like where you search for the keys
so,
and where the
let's
light
use
is.
an example. I could say to you, brother, can you spare a dime? And then I'm begging, and I'm just using that colloquially, right? But then I can be speaking to my brother. If you have my genealogy and you know my 23andMe and my mother and my father, that's my brother, right? So this is a case where we know now. And the terms, kinship terms in ancient Egypt could be used literally, and they could be used figuratively. So sometimes my sister is just my wife, no relation. Other times your sister is your sister, and you're married to her, you know that too. And where we have genealogies, we can prove both cases and know that both occur. So where it's ambiguous and it just says, this is Amenhotep and his sister, you have to say, was it the sister, is it the wife? But in cases where we have social data to the degree that we have it, we can just know. So that is a really great thing. And those are the only cases I like to use as examples. I wouldn't use an example and call someone brother. Yeah. All right, folks, I'm going to say thank you.